Hello, my name is Tim Kavanaugh, and the piece of art that I'm going to be evaluating is Migrant Mother, a photograph taken by Dorothy Lang. So just a bit of historical background before we get into more details on the photograph. The photograph was taken during the Great Depression, which is the most severe economic crisis in the history of the modern Western world. It was sparked by a stock market collapse in 1929, and throughout the next decade of the 1930s, millions of Americans suffered from unemployment, homelessness, and other economic hardships. The photographer, Dorothy Lang, was an American photographer based in San Francisco, California. She spent most of her youth and early adulthood focusing on studio photography, and then in the 1930s she decided to shift her focus to documenting more real-life moments on the streets, which is where she took photographs during the Great Depression, such as Migrant Mother. Migrant Mother was taken by Lang in 1936. It was published in a San Francisco newspaper, and it went on to gain national attention. I'm also going to be focusing on the work of Judith Butler in Torture and Ethics of Photography. So Butler focuses heavily on the presentation of suffering and what she coins as the grievability of lives. So the grievability of lives is how we determine what lives are grievable and what lives are not. And it's really important to understand framing and the influence of norms. Framing and norms can't be necessarily seen, and they're not physical things. But they're biases and predispositions that influence how we determine what lives are important and what lives aren't important. Butler focuses on wartime photography to look at framing. And while the Great Depression isn't wartime photography, it is what I'm going to look at as crisis photography. And I want to draw a connection between the two. So there's a clear difference, which is that in wartime photography, there is a clear and stated enemy, and in crisis photography, there is not. You can't take a photograph of the Great Depression or a photograph of COVID-19, the actual virus, where you could take a photograph of a terrorist during war. However, there are similarities between the two, and the main is that photographs taken are generally taken of human suffering. There's also the important connection of state power and the importance of governments in deciding who takes photographs, what they're photographing, and how those photographs are distributed and trying to influence the public reception to photographs. I think that representation and response are a really good way to expose how frames and norms exist in a photograph, even if we can't physically see them. And it's important to look at who is represented and how they're represented. So after the Great Depression, the photographer Dorothy Lang moved on to take pictures of Japanese Americans leading up to and during the period of internment camps during the 1940s. Two photographs next to Migrant Mother here are of young Japanese Americans standing for the Pledge of Allegiance right before the beginning of internment camps, and a young Japanese American adult with his luggage heading to an internment camp. And these three photographs, the two of Japanese Americans and the one of Migrant Mother, had very different reactions. While Migrant Mother gained national attention and eventually became a post stamp, and resulted in the U.S. government delivering 20,000 pounds of food to the campsite where it was taken, the pictures of Japanese Americans did not elicit even close to a similar response. Internment camps continued throughout the culmination of World War II in 1945, and the very different reactions to these photographs kind of expose the biases and ideas of who we qualified as human and who we did not in America, even when the photographs were taken by the same exact photographer. Butler also works through an argument or a disagreement that she has with another American philosopher, Susan Sontag. And Sontag says that photographs themselves don't have a moving quality about them. It's the reaction to the photographs, which we just went through, that determines the meaning of the photo. And for this reason, Sontag thinks that captions are really important in helping to develop some kind of context behind what is happening in a photograph and help people determine more accurate meanings to that photograph. Butler, on the other hand, thinks that captions aren't necessary and instead says that photographic interpretation is really important because it kind of shows us how our frames work and allows us to work through frames in a way that we couldn't do if we were given captions to understand the image. And captions, in a way, Butler feels, take away from an image. And people who agree with Butler would say that captions take away from some of the importance of an image. The caption for Migrant Mother was very simple. It was destitute pea pickers in California, a 32-year-old mother of 7 children, and then the date of the photograph. Florence Owens Thompson is the woman that we're actually looking at in Migrant Mother. And she was 32 at the time of the photograph, and the children seen on her arms are 2 of her 7 children. Both of her parents were of Cherokee descent, which makes Florence an American Indian woman. And her family at the time was traveling through the country looking for work. They picked cotton and peas, they bartended, they provided medical care, among many other jobs trying to bring in money for their family. In later interviews, Thompson and her children said that Lang's description in later interviews about the encounter was a bit fabricated and that they barely actually interacted with the photographer. They contested some of her accounts of the encounter. I want to leave with the question of how you think a more extensive caption about the lady in this photograph, Florence Owens Thompson, may have impacted its reception, and what that says about our frames and our biases and how norms work toward the interpretation of a photograph.